Hello and welcome to the A plus generator. Today we are going to talk about the types of hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a guess or a hunch about something. There are two types of hypotheses. We have the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. So what do we mean by null hypothesis? So the null hypothesis is the hypothesis of interest and is usually denoted by HO, or that is the beta naught, which is equal to 0. Okay, so the null hypothesis is the hypothesis of interest and it is usually denoted by HO, where the beta is equal to 0. So I want you to note the equal sign is equal to 0. So we will discuss further about the null hypothesis, but let us look at the alternative hypothesis. So the alternative hypothesis is the hypothesis that is tested against the hypothesis of interest. Remember that you have said that the hypothesis of interest is the null hypothesis. So the alternative hypothesis is tested against the null hypothesis. And the alternative hypothesis is denoted by H1 or HA. So the alternative hypothesis is usually denoted by beta naught is not equal to 0. So if it is tested against the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis we have said is equal to 0, then the alternative hypothesis will not be equal to 0. Okay? So for example, let us look at an example. Suppose you are carrying out a research to determine whether the profits of a company are influenced by sales. Okay, so you'll have to come up with a regression model, for example, where y is equal to the alpha plus the beta x plus this is called the error term. Okay, so where y is equal to the profit, this is the alpha, we have the beta, and x is equal to the sales, and this is the error term. Okay, so if the profits, remember that y is the dependent variable and x is the independent variable. So we see that the profit is dependent on the sales. But remember, there are other factors that may influence the profits. Remember that in our research, we are determining the profits, whether the profits are influenced by only the sales. So the error term will account for other factors that influence the profit, but we have not measured them in our equation. So these other factors, for example, we have the cost of goods sold. The direct cost, the cost of making this or producing the goods. Okay, those costs can also influence the profits. We also have the operating expenses, okay, such as the salaries, the rent. Remember, those expenses can also influence the profit, because if we have more cost of goods or more operating expenses, when you have the sales being constant, the profit, the company may not realize the profit. Okay, so that is why we put the error term in the regression model to account for other factors that may influence the profits apart from the sales. So when you have that, when you have this example, or what hypothesis can we make from this? So when we have to make the null hypothesis, okay, remember that the null hypothesis is denoted by HO, where the beta coefficient is equal to 0. Okay. So if it is equal to 0, we say that X does not influence Y. That is, the sales does not influence the profits or the slope. Remember that this beta represents the slope, while the alpha represents the y-intercept. Okay, so the slope coefficient is not statistically significant in the case of null hypothesis. The slope coefficient is not statistically significant, or X does not influence Y. That is, the sales does not influence the profit. So if the sales does not influence the profit, that means that there are other factors that may be influencing the profits in that company. The alternative hypothesis, we see that is denoted by HA, where the beta coefficient is not equal to 0. So if the beta coefficient is not equal to 0, then we say that X does influence Y, that is, the sales influences the profits, okay? Or the slope coefficient is statistically significant. There are 3 common approaches that are used to test the hypothesis, okay? And these common approaches, we have the confidence interval approach, the test of significance approach, and the probability value approach. So I know you might be wondering, how will I know that I have to reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis if the slope coefficient is statistically significant. So to know if it is statistically significant or not statistically significant, are approaches that are used to test this hypothesis. And the 3 approaches I have mentioned are used to determine whether the slope is statistically significant or not statistically significant. So the aim of this video was for you to know what do we mean by the null hypothesis and what do we mean when we say alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is where X does not influence Y, or the slope coefficient is not statistically significant. While in the alternative hypothesis, the X does influence Y and the slope coefficient is statistically significant. So when you carry out your research by using the 3 approaches in hypothesis testing, if you get that your beta coefficient, for example, that if the test of significance is less than 0.05, okay, that is when that you can be able to conclude that the slope coefficient is statistically significant. So if the slope coefficient is statistically significant, you are going to reject the null hypothesis that says the slope coefficient is not statistically significant. But I will cover the 3 common approaches in my next videos to give you a better understanding of what we mean by accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay, so thank you for watching. Please like and comment down below if the video has been helpful.